Welcome, good morning. You're at the Planning for Healthy Communities session, and I'm your moderator, Jennifer Ruley. I'm with the Louisiana Public Health Institute. So welcome. So we are honored to have two distinguished guests presenting here today, Peter Calthorpe and Elizabeth Baca, who will be presenting on the use of scenario development tools in planning healthy communities. More than anything, what you'll be hearing this morning are examples of how data and tools can support collaborative approaches to health. These tools are of particular interest to Louisiana communities where significant planning has occurred in the wake of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. The Louisiana Public Health Institute has been a longstanding partner in shaping the built environment to maximize health outcomes. For more than a decade, LPHI has partnered with the City of New Orleans through a unique combination of corporate and public funding to expand the city's bikeway network to more than 100 miles, complete the Lafitte Greenway, and improve pedestrian safety. Over the past year, LPHI supported the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals on a community health assessment process that was based on the core principle that achieving the goal of healthy people and healthy communities is a difficult and complex task that cannot be accomplished through a single plan of action or by a single governmental agency or non-governmental entity. The process used data to engage a wide variety of stakeholders so that collaborative approaches to health could be forged at the local, regional, and state levels. This effort will result in a soon-to-be-released statewide plan to improve the health of Louisiana residents. LPHI is also currently working with several Gulf coastal communities to build digital community health databases as a means of informing decision-making, engaging citizens, and supporting local planning efforts. So how can we plan for healthier communities? Before we introduce our guests, I will ask you to please hold your questions to the end, and we will be happy to allow our guests to answer your questions. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our guests. First, we will hear from Peter Calthorpe. Mr. Calthorpe is the founder and principal of Calthorpe Associates, an award-winning consulting firm devoted to sustainable urban design and planning globally. He is also one of the founders and the first board president of the Congress of New Urbanism. Throughout his long-honored career in urban design, planning, and architecture, he has been a pioneer of innovative approaches to urban revitalization, community planning, and regional design. His seminal plans for Portland, Salt Lake City, Los Angeles, and post-hurricane southern Louisiana demonstrated a more interactive approach to environmental design at the metropolitan scale. Internationally, his work in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East has demonstrated that community design with a focus on environmental sustainability and human scale can be adapted throughout the globe. Recently, he led a groundbreaking statewide urban design effort, Vision California, to inform the implementation of the state's climate change legislation. He is the co-author of several influential books, including Sustainable Communities and The Regional City, Planning for the End of Sprawl. His latest book, Urbanism in the Age of Climate Change, documents his work relating patterns of development to energy and carbon emissions, along with other environmental, social, and economic impacts. Our second speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Baca, who is the Senior Health Advisor with the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Dr. Baca is passionate about innovations to foster total health and well-being. She is engaged in innovation in the public sector to foster health through multiple projects, including healthy planning, big data, and public-private partnerships. For healthy planning, she works across sectors to foster collaboration, elevate the connection between health and the built environment, and leads the effort to incorporate health considerations into the planning process to build healthy, resilient communities. A significant part of her work is aligning wins for projects that offer co-benefits, particularly with respect to climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. For big data, she is working on projects to link data sets to the planning process. Additionally, she serves as the Office of Planning and Research's lead for the governor's initiative to advance precision medicine. So, without further ado, Peter Calthorpe.
Coming up? Oh, good. Data. Well, you know, after Ron's inspirational talk, it may seem a little boring to get back to data and computer analysis. But I think we all recognize, you know, I think everybody who's here believes that smart growth can make a big difference. The question is, how do you get there? We all know it's politics. There's no advancement we're going to make in this arena that it doesn't involve politics. And politics involves coalitions. So I try to use data to build coalitions, to build participation, to build commitment, to build engagement, and to build, you know, that terrible word now that is never heard anymore, compromise. When you look at all the issues that we have to confront and this idea that we have to connect the dots between all these factors, what I see is an amazing universe of coalitions. It's not just government that exists in stovepipes, it's special interest groups. Each one of those issues over the island of Hawaii there is a special interest group, and that tends to think in a stovepipe. And the degree to which we can get everybody's mind open enough to see that they have common cause and that they can actually have more political power by joining a larger coalition around smart growth, the better off we are. And so how do you do that? Well, over time, we've done regional plans all over the country. I think some of them were mentioned. And we developed a methodology which has three important steps. First is people have to understand what's really going on. You need the information, the data about existing conditions. More often than not, it's not easily accessible, and it's misunderstood, and stereotypes rule over facts. We watch stereotypes ruling over facts in every political debate that we seem to watch these days. Facts don't seem to matter that much, and that's a scary proposition. But I think when you put them together in narratives that make sense, people will begin to re-engage with facts. So first step is get all the information. Understand the place, understand the people, understand the history, understand the economics. The second step is to engage as broad a group as possible in what we call scenario building. There is no one right solution. There are many future outcomes, and for people to feel engaged in a process, they have to see their preconception. Maybe they will give up their preconception at some point, but they have to see it on the table. They have to see it taken seriously. They have to see it engaged and analyzed. And so the process of building scenarios is an opportunity for each special interest group to put their idea on the table and have it become part of the dialogue, the discussion. And for everybody to feel like, you know, there's no question in my mind, I have preconceptions, and, you know, I know exactly how every design project should come out. But when I go through this process, I always end up with a different solution than the one I thought I would. So when I actually study the facts, instead of getting involved in preconceptions, and when I engage in scenarios, many what-ifs. What if we were to do this? What if we were to shoot for that? What if we were to combine these two aspects? I know this all sounds very abstract, but it's a very important process. And the great thing about scenarios is it gives you the foundation to then do co-benefits analysis. So if you take the scenarios that are built out of this coalition thinking, and you analyze them across a whole range of issues, not one issue, say climate change or something like that, or social equity or human health, but across a whole range of them, all of a sudden you have a foundation for not only the best decision, but also a coalition that sees how their issues integrate with all the other issues. So that's a three-step process that we've evolved over it's 25 years now of doing this work. Before I got here to Louisiana, and I think one of the reasons I got to work here in Louisiana is that we were successful with this process in very conservative, we were famous for doing the Portland work, but everybody said, well, that's just Portland. That doesn't count. That's not America. And it will certainly not apply here. But we were able to do the same thing in Salt Lake, a very conservative community, very religious community, and with a huge tradition of sprawl. The biggest and the boldest sprawl you could ever imagine. And yet we went through this process of shaping scenarios with a big coalition, a big tent, everybody from the Mormon Church to the few environmentalist groups that were there to business and elected officials. And we looked at the alternatives, and we looked at the data that was produced by them. And what was interesting, and I'm just going to show a few of this data, and this is before we developed the computer model that I'm about to talk to. So we did this all by hand. It was very time-consuming, very expensive. But as an example, the Mormon Church was very interested in affordable housing, largely because they wanted the next generation of Mormons to stay put, to not leave Salt Lake and the kind of community that they'd created there. And there wasn't enough affordable housing. Why? Because there wasn't housing diversity. All the houses were big and on big lots. Only 11% of the housing, and you can see it here, scenario A is business as usual, 11% multifamily housing was being built in the area. Nothing available. So that's getting the facts on the table so people could actually see, well, where are we? Oh, that does connect to our problem. But this was one metric that connected to the Mormon Church, which in the end made them huge advocates for smart growth, because they also believed in communities, and actually even walkable communities. Their ward system was all about how you could walk. And so they connected the dots and saw, well, we could get age-integrated neighborhoods, we could get first-time buyer housing, and we could get it all in a package that allowed people to walk. Lo and behold, you have what they think of as wards, what we used to think of as new urbanism. Same thing. So it was a win there. Now you have the state legislature filled with ultra-conservative Republicans who really, this idea of people using cars less and living in multifamily, living urban lives, really not in the DNA of the political ideology. But they had a strong foundational belief in fiscal responsibility. And it turns out smart growth is fiscally the most responsible thing to do if you get the data on the table. So a lot of fiscal conservative Republicans who don't believe in smart growth and don't even believe in climate change in many cases, were all for the least cost growth scenario. And we were able to demonstrate here $15 billion of infrastructure savings, and so all of a sudden they were on board. And so you had this bizarre coalition that you never thought existed: environmentalists, home builders, the Mormon Church, and conservative Republicans, because you were able to get to this scenario process that then bred a co-benefits analysis. And they adopted a state piece of legislation that rivals the one in Oregon, Washington, and now the state of California in its comprehensive thinking about how growth should happen in their state, quality growth strategy. And I won't go into lots of depth there, but that's the outline of what. Now, what we discovered, of course, and we had an amazing opportunity, even more complex set of issues here in Louisiana, because you add the whole issue of storm and wetlands erosion and accessibility and safety and resilience to the standard equation of affordability and livability and demographics, and all of a sudden you have an even more complex mix. John Fregonesi and I worked on this with Boo and her team, and it was had great outcomes, but the same process. What are the scenarios? Let the different interest groups shape the scenarios, and what are the results? Now, I'll fast forward. After developing this process, we had an opportunity in the state of California to actually turn it into an algorithm, because it was really laborious to take each scenario and measure it against all these different metrics. And so luckily, the state gave us the capacity to build something called Urban Footprint, which is a scenario system, allows people to put in different scenarios and get co-benefits analysis directly out. And these are the 3 steps that I've already mentioned: data development and organization, scenario development, and then analysis. But the first one is also very interesting. Every city has its own zoning code, has its own planning documents, and many of them don't have highly evolved GIS databases. So they actually don't know what's going on. If you ask them how many lots are available for redevelopment, they really would not be able to query a database and figure that out. So they don't know what their redevelopment potential is. They don't know how affordable housing costs are distributed. Many don't. And what's worse is within a metropolitan region, these plans can't speak to each other because they're all speaking a different language. So for the state of California, we developed a common language and translated all the general plans of counties and cities and regions into a common language that has embedded in it not just single uses, but also mixed use, more sophisticated place types. So that data development and organization in and of itself is really quite amazing. Now, this is all driven by a new law in the state of California, SB 375, which calls for each region in the state to develop a smart growth scenario that will reduce carbon emissions in multiple ways. But land use became part of the solution to the question of how do we implement our statewide low carbon initiative. We want to meet the Kyoto standards on our own. And we can't do it without land use, and we can't do land use without political consensus at the local level. And so the tool becomes very important, not only for measuring compliance with the law, the state law, but also the tool by which you can arrive at local consensus. So that's the background on all that. Now, the pieces, as I said, the tool is unfortunately still under development. It turns out it works, but the user interface that we have to develop in order to get it easy for everybody to just sit down and use themselves turns out to be actually more a bigger job than actually figuring out the algorithms themselves. But anyway, managing and reviewing data, updating the local plans so that they all speak to each other and that they can speak into this tool that then provides the results. The sketch futures, here's a piece in San Diego where we're literally just coloring out different land use scenarios on the map, which become the scenarios that are measured and put against each other. And then finally, this whole issue of multi-metric or co-benefits analysis. You don't just measure one thing, you measure all of the above. And this is a constantly growing list. We keep adding things to the things that we can assess as part of this tool. So I'll go back to the simplest and biggest analysis. The first analysis we used was Vision California, looking at different scenarios, but just to demonstrate the polar opposites between business as usual and smart growth, we shaped the state's growth around either 70% of typical sprawl or 55% of compact. Now, compact is not urban, it's just 2- and 3-story mixed-use walkable communities, something we might think of as a classic American town or streetcar suburb. And the difference is on the state level through the year 2050, long-term thinking, is really quite remarkable. The amount of land consumption is extraordinary, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'll just give you a flavor. I won't talk about what it all means, but the business as usual, we could actually graphically show the difference in land consumption of the different scenarios. This helps politically. Analyzing farm and agricultural business helped. That's another special interest group that came into the fold here for smart growth because they saw erosion of ag land. VMT, of course, is the mother stone of carbon and energy, how much we use cars, and it can be dramatically affected. And here is a map of the LA region that just shows the red zones are where people travel over 30,000 vehicle miles per household per year. The green zones, even in LA, are relatively modest. Energy consumption, auto fuel, this is pocketbook, building energy changes without energy conservation or solar or anything like that. Just more compact buildings save energy. Water, this is our biggest special interest these days in California with our drought, and smart growth helps there. Being able to put a number to all this adds the momentum, adds to the political coalition. This goes to the local elected officials. What are the infrastructure costs for new infrastructure and growth? What are the operation and maintenance costs? What are the revenue implications of different forms of growth? When you put those three factors together, you get a fiscal snapshot of the future of a lot of towns in the Central Valley, anyway, in California, that were going under in terms of their bond rating. Health, activity related. How much do people walk? It is based on, as Ron was pointing out, it's based on community. And respiratory, which is connected to air quality, which is connected to the amount we use cars. So we're able to actually put measurements on all these things, and then finally the raison d'etre for the whole thing was the greenhouse gas emissions and how far along the way we could go. What really turned the tide is household costs. You know, in 2008, I think we saw a demonstration of the fact that a large percentage of the American middle class could not afford the old-style sprawl version of the American dream. A house, a distant location on a cul-de-sac with cars. When you add the transportation costs to the mortgage costs, it exceeded what people really have to spend. And so a more affordable lifestyle actually is really important. And this is one of those metrics that's terribly important. Fast forward, we've done a lot of these now. I'll give you one other example because it was interesting. In Honolulu, the rail line that was funded by the feds in a city that really, you know, was perfect, linear and dense, perfect for transit, was being stopped by, of all people, the environmental groups because they thought it was growth-inducing. That their attitude was the best way to control environmental factors on their island was to keep people from being there. And the truth of the matter is the housing costs were so high, the next generation were all leaving the island. And so there was something deeply sad about this and deeply contradictory. So by doing the scenario process and building different futures, we were able to show them that as the environmental community led by the Sierra Club, they needed to get on board with transit and transit-oriented development. And lo and behold, at the end of the process, they did. And the new mayor is now moving forward with the investment in transit. So they're all the metrics, but every once in a while you come up with one that's really startling, which was this one, roadway costs. It turned out that if they didn't build a $5 billion transit system, which everybody says we can't afford a $5 billion transit system, it turned out to handle the same growth and the same trips, they would have to spend $9 billion double-decking their freeway. So by framing things as scenarios, as you get to either do this or this, you don't get to do this or nothing. The future doesn't stop just because you don't want to make a decision, was the message there. And the same is true, I'll mention later today, on high-speed rail in California and around the country. Everybody says we can't afford $94 billion for high-speed rail in California. Well, the reality is, if we don't build it, and we still have those trips from northern to southern and southern to northern California, we'd have to expand highways and expand airport and gate capacity, and that will actually cost $180 billion to expand airports and highways, enough to handle the same number of trips. So the either-or comparison is very powerful. It clears the mind of the rhetoric that, you know, we should do nothing because we can't afford anything. Well, the truth is, you will be spending money. The question is, what is the smartest way? And, you know, I should get off here. I don't know how long I've gone on. But, you know, there are ways of taking this, and it seems geekish, all this data, and communicating it. For one project in the Bay Area, we did scenarios, but then we put it on a website and let people actually choose, build their own scenario and look at their own results. And so there was page 1 where they were introduced to the issue. Page 2, they were able to rank their concerns. Page 3, they were able to build a scenario by combining different types of growth in the area. And page 4 was, what are the outcomes of the scenario you chose? How does it work? And each one of these tabs allows people to drill down, and if they're really interested in health issues, they can drill down and actually see what the metrics mean and how the numbers were arrived at. And so this kind of interactive, here's the outcomes. Oh, I'm sorry, I got off base there. Yeah, these are outcomes. You can drill down, etc. And then there's a page where people can then get involved politically. So I think that this kind of process is something that not only can engage the stakeholders, which is what we normally do, but also can be pushed out so that everybody can engage it. We do live on the web these days. People are used to getting lots of information there. And they're used to having an interactive relationship, not just going there to get the facts, but to say, what's my version of the future? How's it going to work? Gee, while I'm here, maybe I'll experiment with something I don't believe in, but see how it works. And all of a sudden, you have somebody else who's willing to participate on a level that I don't believe they had before. So, you know, I still am the only guy in my office who doesn't use a computer for design. I still use pencils and paper, which is a sign of age. But we have evolved to a point where this capacity for analysis is amazing. And this tool, I believe, can change outcomes everywhere. You know, in the end, you can advocate for something, smart growth, and we can all believe it's the right thing. I don't think that really works, you know, because we end up talking to ourselves. What we need is to give people the tools to get the right information, to go through a healthy process, and to have robust coalitions emerge. And if you give people those tools rather than answers, I think you can make the biggest difference of all. So in my last phase of my career here, I'm turning into a computer startup company and trying to turn this into something that really will be ubiquitous. And actually, it's something we use all over the world now. So I think that's all the slides I have, and I don't want to go on and on. I'll let Elizabeth have a turn here. But anyway, that's what we have to offer, and it grew out of what we did here and in other places, and I'm very excited and hopeful to see it used pretty much throughout the world. Thank you. I'm just going to unplug this thing here. Okay. Oh, there.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. This, I have to say, I literally tears came to my eyes this morning with Ron Sims. It really is so powerful, and I think it's been great working with Peter and his team. So I just wanted to, perfect. I just wanted to say thank you for having me here today. It's my first time to Louisiana, so I think, you know, even the Uber driver was like asking a ton of questions. I was really excited to be here. And when I first came in, just seeing that walkway, I can't actually wait to go and walk along, and it's beautiful. But I think that's really just, it gives you a sense of how much work has happened, and it's really exciting to be presenting here today with everybody. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm a physician, and just a little bit of background, I thought what I would do, I'll talk about how we've been developing a health module to work with the scenario development, but I also wanted to give a little bit of context, especially for some of the local jurisdictions who are starting to undertake this, to maybe think about how there are different opportunities and different ways to align in some of the contexts specifically within California. So the Governor's Office of Planning and Research was established in 1970 by statute, and we serve as a long-range planning office for the governor and his cabinet to inform him on long-range planning issues. We work on drought, we work on climate change, we work on health issues. It's a really multidisciplinary agency, and it's really fun to work together because we bring together such different perspectives. So one of my favorite people of all times was Albert Einstein, and I love to start with this quote that we cannot solve our problems with the same level of thinking that created them. And I like to start with this because one is I'm a physician with a background in policy, and yet I spend much of my time working with planners, planning commissioners, and elected officials to talk about how our health is really influenced by our community. And I think it's really key, especially as we're working with coalitions and working with other folks, and I think Ron mentioned that today, that a lot of it really starts with listening. And that means opening our minds to thinking about different ways of solving problems. And I think that's actually been one of the biggest lessons that we've learned as we've gone through this process. So when I used to work, so back in a few years back, I was still seeing patients. And I was on faculty at Stanford, and I used to teach medical students and residents. And one of the first questions I would always ask them is, what does health mean to you? And it was funny, like, you know, some would be like, well, it's that I can go and walk along the walkway, or someone might say it's that I don't have a disease. Some were the more biochemically oriented, so they would talk about all of the different enzymatic processes. It was very, very cute. But I think one of the really interesting things is that health is really also about livability. It's about how we're able to live to our fullest potential, and it's not just the absence of disease. And what you see and what we heard this morning is there are so many struggles. So when we look at the challenges that you face to live a healthy life, whether it really does matter, are there parks and places to play? Do you have access to healthy foods? Are you in a place that's safe? When I worked with children as a pediatrician, many of the kids, even as young as 2, our health and our outcomes have changed so much that we actually started screening for cholesterol as young as 2. And many of the kids already had high cholesterol. And so we recognize that there's so much else, so many other things going on. And in screening in clinical practice, we would try to do all these things that we had within the clinical setting. That was, let's get them out on their bikes, and you know, it's like, well, it's not safe, or we had a shooting, or there's no place for us to ride. And so you quickly realize, and we started to partner with the city and the county officials to try and change some of those built environment things. But really, there's this huge transformation going on within healthcare, which is a huge opportunity to do a lot of this work. And I think a lot of it comes through data, because it's a place where we can get common ground. There are a lot of places who've started to do these quality of life reports. This was actually from Jacksonville, Florida. I think they were like the first group that started doing this, and this was back in the 80s when they started. And it was really ironic because they inherently chose one of their quality of life indicators as vehicle miles traveled, which I thought was fascinating. So, you know, inherently they understood that spending a ton of time in your car wasn't really great for your life, or having time with your family. And so I think it was a starting point, but a lot of places have started to do indicators, and we've seen it start to grow. So there's this movement to do dashboards, so a lot of cities and counties have started to look at community and think about population and public health outside of the clinic. And there are programs, so I think that the level of sophistication has really started to grow as well. So not just looking at a dashboard, but thinking about geographical information. This is the Robert Wood Johnson Health Rankings. This is for the state of California. If you haven't been on there, they have it across the entire United States. It's really fantastic. You can look at county level data for things from the built environment, but also health outcomes. And so, you know, it's growing, but one of the challenges is that these programs are fantastic, but it's actually not always used in policy and planning. And that's really where I think there's such a strength within the planning area. Some of the data has actually become much more actionable in the public realm, and it's been integrated into daily decision making. So this is actually using health data in a Yelp application. So Yelp, you can go on, you can rate restaurants, you can, you know, rate different services. And what they've done in some of the cities is they've started to use the public health data to look at what's the quality of the restaurant, have they been shut down? So it's great because it's actually starting to change some of the relationship within community and how they relate to health and making decisions. And in California in particular, we have a lot of really interesting things that have happened. One, I think just the national context is that we have seen a lot of transformation in thinking about population health much more. There were some funding opportunities with community transformation grants, which really allowed people to partner in ways that hadn't happened before. But in California, as Peter mentioned, we have some specific legislation. So we have complete streets legislation in place, and we also have the sustainable community strategy. So the SB 375 and AB 32 both helped align at the state level, really trying to do some of these planning processes. And what we realized is that a lot of the goals to create more sustainable communities that were more environmentally sustainable also were the same things to create healthier communities. In California specifically, we've had a couple of things that have really helped create momentum around this. One is back in 2012, the governor issued an executive order recognizing that we're spending so much of the state's GDP on poor health outcomes. And this is happening across the US. If you look at somewhere around, between 18 and 20% of how much we're spending, and as you think about sustainability, not just for infrastructure, but also health systems, we recognize that we need to be doing things to create more health and not just access to health. Within the governor's task force, one of the things that the report on the left side was actually to foster healthier communities. And so it was great because it set up a framework to start thinking about this at a statewide level. The other thing is the Strategic Growth Council, which is a cabinet level council that meets. So it has the Secretary from Health and Human Services, it has the Secretary for the Department of Food and Ag, it has Natural Resources, the Environmental Protection Agency, all working together. And the Health and All Policies Task Force was one of the first things, again thinking about breaking down silos, to work on health and all policies, which really brought thinking about health decisions into all realms of decision making. We also have the state wellness plan, so that's there on the right. And one of the things is, since we do so much partnership, the Office of Planning and Research was really thinking about updating our comprehensive plan guidelines, we call them the general plan in California, but to really start integrating health into that process. And so we've done that. And then I would say the other big thing is really the local government innovators. So all of this really happens on the ground. And it's been really key to have those partnerships. So as we've thought about this, and again, thinking about data as the integrator, what we've done is really think about how we can use data in the process to think about community engagement, to think about bringing people in and creating a common language. And you can. I think one of the things is people say, oh, well, when we talk about the scenario planning tool, they say, oh, that seems like so much. That's really a challenge to really start to get to that point. And I think one of the keys is that you can even start at a much more basic level of just looking at existing conditions. And that's huge because one is it can really say this is where you are as a starting point and to go from there. So for example, if a community is interested in thinking about active living, just being able to map out existing conditions, as Peter mentioned, a lot of places don't necessarily have that data available, and so they're not even thinking about it. But what we've been doing, working with Calthorpe and also working with our Department of Technology, is creating tools to bring that in as a baseline for existing conditions and to think about policies that are related. And I think that this is so key because as Peter was mentioning, it's really about coalition building. So if you're trying, and this is one of the things having worked within public health, is it's so challenging when you're trying to think about changing the infrastructure, changing the roads, creating more park space. But it's really that it's a lot of the same goals and everyone's trying to work in the same direction. And so what data can do is really start to align that to help with funding and infrastructure. So you say, okay, well, there's data for existing conditions. Is it possible then to do forecasting, to do predictive analytics, to say if we make this change in the built form, what happens to health? And so that was a process that we started about 2 years ago, building off of some of the work that Calthorpe and Associates had already done. And so we brought together a team at the state level, a technical team, because there are a lot of really challenging technical questions around what data is available and what scale is available, the granularity, to think about how we could go through this process. So for the data for forecasting, we ended up using the urban footprint tool, since all of that data is in there, which has been fantastic. And then looking at some of the data sets that are California specific. So we used the California Health Interview Survey as well as the Transportation Survey to start to integrate that. And it's really based on all of the literature, the academic literature that shows how much your built form impacts your health outcome. And I think that one of the key things is that it's complicated, is the general theme, but it is possible. So if you're looking at different types of land use patterns, to link that to travel behavior, and then to say then you would see these costs and these health outcomes. I think the big key is that this was very much a process of learning together. So we brought together this technical team. We had a steering committee from the state level across different agencies, and then a lot of technical experts that we would thoughtfully think through all of the methodologic challenges as this was going forward. And it's really thinking about taking the base year data, doing transportation changes, and then looking at the future year. Again, there were a whole host of things that we were looking at, walkability, other health outcomes, and this is essentially working with our Council of Governments. We have two that we've been working with. This is in the Southern California area, but this basically shows that the public health scenario in 2040, if accomplished with smarter growth, would allow for more walking, more biking, and then actually decreases in type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and high blood pressure. And it looks like they're small numbers, but at the population level, that's actually a really huge outcome. And this is all, we're still in the process of actually talking through with all of the partners how to present this, but I would say that the predecessor to this was something called Rapid Fire, and it was used in Fresno, which was a place that had continually grown urban sprawl, suffered from urban sprawl, and very poor health outcomes. And it was a really powerful tool because what they were able to do was actually use that data as a community outreach tool and engagement to have the place packed with people who were very much interested in the scenario that was going to be better for health, better for economics, and better for smart growth, and they were successful in getting that plan adopted. So I think, one of the biggest things, and I really resonated when Ron was saying, like, what is your purpose? And, having spent a number of years in clinical practice and teaching, having a great clinician is really important, but when you recognize how much our life and our quality of life is linked to where we live, where we spend our time, where we work, it's really important to think about the future of creating a place that's sustainable, and I think much of that can actually happen through creating healthy communities. So, thank you.
Before we get started with questions, I have a question of my own to ask the panelists. So in thinking about collaborations and solving problems and how, and what we heard from Ron Sims this morning, and then the work that you guys are doing, the problems that we're trying to solve are constantly changing. So what are some of the trends in thinking about what we're here 10 years after our first Smart Growth Summit? Over the next 10 years, what are some of the trends that will shape and impact the work that you're doing over the next 10 years? Is it health? Is it climate change? What are those things that you're tracking in your work? And how do you think that these are things that will transform cities, communities, regions?
You want to go? Okay. So I think there are a lot of things. I think one is, and this was a big issue as we were thinking about the scenario planning tool and integrating data, we're stuck with the data that we have. And I think it's important to start somewhere, because you can't have it be perfect. But I think the data sources and the collection and how we're using big data is really transforming. For instance, there's a number our Department of Transportation is starting to do this, using cell phones and being able to monitor cell phone movement through space, which is able to say, like, what are commute patterns and how fast they're going and what type of form they're doing. So I think that what's going to happen is we're going to get a whole host of data that we weren't collecting otherwise. Another one was a great example that I just heard of for a smart bench that can actually charge your cell phone, but it also can pick up cell phone information. So again, it's looking at park usage. It's actually able to embed sensors, thinking about heat islands and resiliency. And so I think as we start to integrate that data, we'll have much more robust models to be able to predict what will happen in the future.
Boy, it's such a big question. What next? I want to say that the resiliency questions are clearly what's next. I tend not to focus on that because I'm still back at we can stop climate change before it really overwhelms the planet. And I think that there's this arm wrestling going on now between those that believe we kind of are going to fail and we better get the barricades up, and those who still believe that we can actually head this thing off. And so for me, solving climate change is still very much the challenge. And at the same time, resilience, being wise about how to shape our communities so that they can withstand some climate change, is going to be the next generation of stuff. Now, back on the more optimistic side, we can change it. I do think technology and science is going to come to the rescue. And I don't mean that in some, amazing silver bullet fusion energy type breakthrough, but in things that are really obvious and aren't going to happen. So, for example, I think transit is going to go through a massive revolution very soon. Everybody's, Google and all the rest of them are talking about autonomous vehicles, and they're thinking about it in all the wrong ways, right? It's private vehicles making it easier to commute longer distances because you don't have to pay attention while you're sitting in the car. So all the health and sprawl aspects of commuting are still present, but you're not bored because you can watch a movie while your car drives you to work. But if you take that same technology and imagine it being used instead of large buses, but on dedicated right-of-ways, it basically replacing BRT with what I call ART, autonomous rapid transit. You have to have the dedicated right-of-way. There has to be a political consensus that space in the public realm should be allocated proportional to its level of equitable use. But you can imagine driverless vehicles taking you on dedicated right-of-ways very rapidly, direct to destination without having to make stops. You would have a transit system that was very affordable because drivers are one of the biggest expenses. That would run at 100% occupancy because the vehicles actually wouldn't move unless somebody was in them, and which was very attractive to what we call choice riders, people who don't like transit because it's inconvenient and slow and all those other things. So I think we could have a revolution there which would really change the underlying DNA and chemistry. There is a hurdle here now, which is transit is very expensive. It's, we all know that we have to have local walkability. That's the last mile problem, and that's also the health of the community. That's going to stay. But connecting those communities at a regional scale is still one of the biggest questions. So I think that we're going to see huge revolutions in that regard, and I'm very, very optimistic on what the outcomes are going to be.
I'm an optimist too, so we'll share that.
Good. Your graph where everything, the vectors align is, actually I want to get a copy of that.
Okay.
It really is true. Rarely in life do you get so much good news falling into the same channel. And so that's the reason that I have for optimism. And quite frankly, I've been working less in the United States and more around the world, and I see lots of reasons for optimism in all those environments too.
Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions. Sir?
Sure. My question is, my big pet peeve is that at a very local level, we still have communities all over the United States that aren't walk-friendly, they're not bike-friendly, they're still hostile. Despite all this information that we've talked about for decades, we're still largely building a transportation system that is still hostile toward walking and biking and other things. And so when you look back at when we authorized land use zoning back in the 1926, it was based upon health, safety, and welfare. And when I go to a zoning meeting where we're discussing what we're going to do, or if we go to a transportation meeting where they're talking about the next transportation improvement, no one from the health community is there. And so in our community, we're starting a healthy communities dialogue and getting the public health officials and others together to begin to focus on this. So we're listening to somebody else besides the fire chief explain how our community needs to be built. So my question is do you have a good model out there or a place that's already got their public health officials showing up in influencing these decisions about what our transportation systems are, what our land use policy is?
What community are you from?
I'm from Lafayette.
Oh, awesome.
From anywhere.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent. One of the things Jennifer and I were speaking about before we started is a lot of it is there's so many forces transitioning, and so it's great. It's a great opportunity. But traditionally, public health has not necessarily dealt with these issues. Public health was really, I mean, in the beginning, planning and public health were very much aligned. And then there was this divergence. And it was very much about vaccines and kind of, you know, more acute diseases. And now that that's really been not solved, but really taken just great leaps forward, it's chronic disease. And they don't have necessarily always the toolkits, and so they don't feel comfortable going out and really engaging in these processes. So it's been a process that we've used throughout our engagement process of even presenting. So I work with the California Conference of Local Health Officers across the entire state of California, and I would say that some jurisdictions are really far ahead of the curve, and they're doing amazing work, and I'm more than happy to connect you with a lot of them if you give me, we'll exchange information, because they really were those early innovators. And usually we think about innovation in terms of, you know, technology, but I think it's also figuring out the people who are willing to take the leadership roles and say, I'm willing to take a small risk in this place, and how do I move it forward? So finding those examples. So Sacramento, they have a lot of great trees. They also have some really great active design work, and they just won a national competition. I work with them a lot, and they're great to learn from. The other thing is creating, it doesn't have to be a huge thing, it can be a small thing. Having done this work across California and worked with a lot of the public health and planning groups, we're actually doing a leadership series right now where I bring together, with sponsorship from the American Planning Association and the Health Officers Association of California, people who are doing this work to feature in webinars. It can be small to start, but I think that, you know, sometimes it's just having some coffee with somebody and just starting to bridge that gap. I think public health departments are increasingly getting engaged in this work, but there's not necessarily the framework to do that, and so we're learning a lot as we go. But I would also say that from a national level, I was just meeting with the Surgeon General recently, who is really interested in this work, because there's this great recognition from our healthcare system that we can't continue to do what we've always done. It's not going to work. That we can't continue to do what we're creating healthier communities. And so I think it's really nice to at least have that leadership at the national level as well, to send a message to local health departments. And you have great leadership here with the Louisiana Public Health Institute. So, yeah.
I think your question is really kind of amazing. You're right. Planning did start based on public health issues. And I remember it was largely about tenements. It was about light and air and access to open space. And it kind of led us to the suburbs in that regard, right? There was, you know, spread people out, would be healthier, disease propagation would be mitigated, and all sorts of things. So it's fascinating to think what a full circle we're about to come back to in that regard. But the fact, the whole idea of coalition building, there are many actors that have to be engaged. And health is one of them, social equity, another one, fiscal responsibility, another one. All these things really need to come together, because changing paradigms is a heavy lift. A habit is the most powerful force in the human condition. And so we have a lot of bad habits now. And it's only with this. So your notion that people from this community need to show up and participate really is an important one.
The back?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm playing the devil's advocate, but something that has been on my mind in relationship to shrinking footprints and, you know, return to urbanization, better transportation, et cetera, is what do we do with the inevitable collapse of the suburbs when that happens? What do we do with these situations where suddenly they're being depopulated and they still have, you know, there's still a footprint out there with all the utilities? How do you deal with them?
That's a great question. What we discover is that the suburbs are the landscape for revitalization and reuse and infill. So you have, the typical structure of the suburbs is you have arterial grids at 1 mile centers. They're underutilized, they're oversized. And so infill and redevelopment along those corridors, especially if those corridors get to be decent transit ways, not only changes the mix complexity, it basically turns the suburbs into compact development. The choice isn't between low-density suburbs and high-density urban. There's something in between that was very American. It used to be called a streetcar suburb, or even the small town. Small towns were inherently mixed-use, walkable. Elm Street did lead to Main Street. So actually reshaping the suburbs is the next order of business, I think, and can happen.
Keep the footprint and just
Yeah, use it as the ground for, and that argues, and you, quite frankly, if you go to ULI, Urban Land Institute meetings, or all the big developers now are no longer doing the giant master plan communities that they used to on greenfields. They're all working at a smaller scale on infill projects. I mean, most telltale, of course, is taking dead malls and turning them into real town centers. That's a suburban piece of landscape that can easily be transformed into something much more robust. So there's several good books out on this. What's the name of, what's her name's book? Anyway.
Yeah. No, I would.
All three of us can't remember. So it's not just my brain that's gone.
I would just to add to that, and I've been at some really amazing presentations on specifically on that question. But I just wanted to, before I forget, also remind folks if they haven't heard, Urban Land Institute has got a whole initiative, and I've partnered with them on some work that we're doing on healthy places. And so it's great on the development side to also have a lot of the similar messages and educational points being shared, because again, it helps kind of build that initial consensus.
Yeah, I mean, this is a telltale sign of fundamental change. 20 years ago, or maybe it was 25 years ago, the ULI would laugh at the new urbanists and smart growth advocates and just say, this is not market-wise, this is not what sells in the marketplace, and we represent the marketplace, and so you're just utopian. And now, I think they produce some of the best work on how to get to smart growth, both in the suburbs and cities. It's amazing turnaround.
Sir?
They don't like to be reminded of that.
My question is about scenarios. I'm from California. I'm living in Baton Rouge now, and I can't move back to California because it's too expensive. I lived for a long time in the Mission District in San Francisco. It's being empty of the people who lived there when I was there. And that's happening actually in New Orleans. So how do your scenarios deal with the market economy? Because if you can't pay, you go play.
Yeah.
And that goes for health as well. And so how much intervention does the public side have to make, because in Louisiana, they're still building out. We have a ring system of failed shopping centers that move out and out east and south of here. And so how do we, that's the question, is that how do you deal with the market forces that, it's cheaper to build out, fill up the swamp, and then put in the infrastructure and just build the houses, start houses, and then this city center is huge gaps, huge empty spaces. So that's what we're dealing with.
How do you deal with that? I think that's a really good question. First of all, there's affordable housing in the Central Valley if you're interested. So, so you can't say all of California is not affordable. And that's a very important, I know it sounds flip, but it's important. The idea of high-speed rail in California is to connect the Central Valley, which is low income, low wage, poor job, to the economic vitality of the coast. Not just about moving executives from San Francisco to LA in 3 hours. So, there's large-scale events that go to this question. I mean, these are wonderful towns with amazing histories that can be superbly livable. Sacramento's a great example, even though it's hot. Some people like the heat. But so, that's a meta solution to your problem. Now, when you come to the Bay Area, which is a very specific problem, choose Bay Area, the regional plan we did, which actually was before the Sustainable Community Strategy mandated by the state, basically asked the question, shall we build enough housing for jobs within the 9-county region, or shall we continue to expect that it's going to leak outward because infill opportunities are too constrained? And so that was the fundamental scenario process there. And it made lots of places very frightened, particularly the wealthy ones who didn't want more housing and didn't want more affordable housing. Silicon Valley has a jobs housing imbalance. And so once again, this is the data side of it. You have to tell people what's going on. There's a deficit of housing on the west side of the bay, where all the jobs are. And so they keep adding jobs, but they don't add housing. So getting that data out there and then identifying where the capacity is to actually build enough housing. I believe if you actually match jobs and housing in a reasonable proximity, you don't have this gentrification slash affordable housing issue. It is a matter of marketplace supply and demand. There isn't a big enough supply. Facing up to that is difficult, and we all know the politics of that. It's very hard. But I will say that SB 375 and the Sustainable Community Strategy didn't go as far as I wanted it to in terms of allocating housing in appropriate locations. But it has made the first steps, and so we now have what they call development priority areas. And so the One Bay Area plan that's been evolved out of this, the Sustainable Community Strategy literally identifies on the map where infill should happen and at what densities. And that's the Sustainable Community Strategy that's being submitted to the state. Now you can say, well, the locals will ignore it. But if the locals ignore it, then all the state and federal money that funnels through the state to these local governments will be cut off. There will be carrots and sticks that result. So that issue is difficult to handle instantly, but is in the process of being handled. I will add one other thing, though, because I'd like to talk too much, but you know, this issue of gentrification being always a bad thing, I think is way overstated. And I just read something in the New Yorker, and I'll have to find the author of it. In Atlantic, that actually said the data shows, number one, that people being forced out of neighborhoods is way overstated. That actually it's not as high a ratio as people expect. And number two, that areas that are quote unquote gentrified, you could also say they're integrated, and there's economic integration, and it actually lifts up the quality of life for the poor people in those neighborhoods. And there's a lot of data out there that shows it. So it's fascinating to me, those of us who have always been for mixed income communities as the healthiest shape, are shying away from saying that, say, near where I am, West Oakland, one of the most low-income violent places, shouldn't be getting gentrified. The reality is the more it gentrifies, the better the kids do in school, the higher the average income is for the low-income population, and the more accessible amenities, and lo and behold, they may actually get a grocery store, which they've never had in that community. So I think we ought to be a little more sanguine about another one of the great stereotypes, how evil gentrification is. Is that controversial enough? Yeah. Thank you.
And real quickly, we have one quick question here.
So Peter, I'm very interested in your urban footprint tool that you've developed, and of course you've been using scenario analysis as a technique for a long time, and you used it here in the Louisiana Speaks process 8-9 years ago. But at that time, it was a little more general, shall we say, and you didn't have the specific data inputs. I think
Well, I think that's why we developed the software, because, our process worked when we were around to kind of do it, each piece by hand and then explain it all. But we need to make a tool, and I think we have, or we're still in the process of, that allows locals to do it themselves. So that does involve a lot of setup. There has to be the database development, and the tool needs to be calibrated so that, the cost of infrastructure, for example, is different here than the cost of infrastructure in California. So there's data assembly and calibration, and then there's training people to, use the tool to build their own scenarios. But I believe until people do it themselves, they're not invested in something. So I can show up, and the process, more often than not is revealing and gets the ball rolling. But in terms of what you're asking about, implementation doesn't happen until people do it themselves, for themselves. And they need the right tools to be able to do that.
And I would just add, I think the example, and we're going through this for the local strategic community, the sustainable community strategy planning, but I think the Fresno example was really key in a place that has had a lot of challenge changing, and because I think each module that has this plug-in component helps build up more interest in getting people to be mobilized. And again, I would say it really was a ton of community engagement to get people to understand the data that was within the tool, but then getting them to be there at the council meetings and to really create a momentum for change was a powerful way of doing
I need
that.
to add one thing because it's a really important question. And I think that at the state level, something that can really help is not that the state mandate smart growth, as it did in Utah or one of these other, but the state mandates a thoughtful process. If the state were to say, we don't know what the right outcome for each jurisdiction is, but we'd like you to go through these steps of actually understanding where you are, creating scenarios, and then measuring the co-benefits or all the metrics. And I don't think that's something that's out of line. That's not too top down. It's basically, and then having the state provide the tools to the local jurisdictions so that they can go through that process. I think that's politically viable because it doesn't predetermine an outcome. It just says, let's be really thoughtful, let's consider a whole range of issues, and let's engage a large group of interest groups. So, I think a combination of tools and state legislation could help.
Awesome. Thank you. A round of applause for our speakers, please.